In this lecture, we shall define the mission, the aesthetic agenda that the new critics set for themselves. We shall discover how much of their criticism was developed in reaction to a rationalistic, positivistic view of society that threatened to render poetry useless and irrelevant. All right, as I've said before, in these two lectures, we will explore the theories of the new critics. Now, nearly all the new critics hail from the American Deep South. Only big difference or exception is I.A. Richards, who actually was British. All the rest of them are American, mostly from the South. They tend to be conservative and canonical in their approach to poetry. And we might add that most of them were religious as well. Now, you can imagine that the Yankee sort of academia of New England does not like the new critics. They've got 3 strikes against them now. They're Southerners, they're conservative, they're canonical, and they're religious. 4 strikes against them. They are not in favor today. Now, most new critics are best known for their skill at poetic explication, for close readings of poems. And we will talk about that in the next lecture. But I want to do something different in this lecture. And the reason is that too often new criticism is reduced only to close reading. There is a lot more to new criticism than just close reading. And so often when new critics are attacked, it is what we call a straw man that is being attacked. The difference is that rather than just close readers, and that is important, they also had a vital aesthetic agenda and mission that they were trying to do. There is a mission to new criticism, not just a pragmatism to it. Now, what is this mission? All the new critics, in one way or another, felt and feared the growing corrosive influence of science, an influence that threatened to render poetry irrelevant. And it's all linked to positivism. Positivism, the reigning religion of their day, early 20th century, and actually late 19th, early 20th, held that rationalism, progress, and technology would usher in a new age of happiness. This is linked to that 4 ages of poetry that Shelley attacked, this idea that poetry is useless in a technological age. Well, again, positivism puts its hope in technology. Now, we live after the atom bomb. Positivism has died a little bit as a faith in, this whole idea of these beautiful glass buildings, a world of perfect science. That's died down a bit now after the wars. But in their time, everybody, like H.G. Wells, thought science was going to take us to the new millennium. Now, to aid in this social transformation, the positives believed, poetry would have to give way to science. Values would give way to facts, the private to the public, internal to the external. Do away with all of those values. We need to be serious, we need to be factual if we're going to bring in this new world of science and technology. And language, too, the positives said, would have to become more concrete, less slippery, in other words. They insisted that there be a one-to-one correspondence between words and the objects or ideas that those words are supposed to signify. In other words, they insisted everything is denotation. One word, one meaning. None of this connotation where words are slippery and can mean lots of different things. What does that mean, of course? That means irony, metaphor, symbolism, paradox, ambiguity, the lifeblood of poetry, has got to be purged as ancient relics of the old, unenlightened days of religion, mystery, ritual, and superstition. We've got to throw that out if we're going to march into the brave new world. And that's a threat to poetry. Any of you who have read George Orwell's great essay, Politics and the English Language? He shows how positivism, he also was against positivism, how it ends up messing up language and making a language that no longer has the beauty. Newspeak, if you've ever read 1984, is a language that tries to purge words of all their connotations. And what happens is, when you purge words of their connotations, people can only think in one way. If all the words have one meaning, you can only think in one way, and that can control people. That was Orwell's problem with it. But again, the new critic's problem is it throws out all that irony that is so important to poetry. Now, although the new critics might have responded to positivism by retreating back to romantic subjectivity, just withdrawing, instead, the new critics chose another subjective way. Instead of doing, an objective way. Rather than being subjective, they decided to be objective. In other words, they sought instead to erect an aesthetic wall around poetry that would preserve it as a complete, self-enclosed artifact that obeyed its own laws. Poetry's under attack. We need to protect poetry. We need to turn poetry into its own world that runs by its own laws. This, by the way, is very Kantian, and new critics are often thought of as neo-Kantians. The new critics chose to take a formalist approach to literature, again like Kant, one that privileges form over content, for it discovers in the aesthetic form of a poem something that borders on the perfect and the transcendent. And if that's true, if they can do that, then over this timeless microcosm, right? Microcosm, Greek for little world. Over this timeless little world, the physical, historical forces of decay and change, not to mention the laws of science, could have no power. If you make poetry into its own universe of frozen, perfect, timeless truths, then nothing can attack it, nothing can tear it down. So this was their mission. This was their way of preserving poetry. And it's possible. Maybe poetry would have become sort of obsolete if it wasn't for them. I think they really did do an important work. I suppose poetry would have come back eventually, as most things do. But I think what they did was very important and very necessary at the time they did it. All right, let's talk about I.A. Richards now specifically. Remember I said he's British, but he inspired the American school of new criticism. Richards was one of the first critics to see the dangers of positivism for those devoted to the composing, analyzing, and teaching of poetry. He saw the danger of positivism early on, and he was the first critic to fight it by creating a separate space for poetry. He sort of started this, calling back on Kant, started this method, this way of defending or preserving poetry. You see, Richards, he well knew that the truths arrived at in poetry were too abstract, too private, too emotional to be taken seriously by an empirical, scientific age that had purged itself of non-factual truth claims. And he knew as well that if poetry were to compete with science on the positivistic playing field of fact and reason, it would lose hands down. Poetry cannot stand up to the scientific rules of verification and logical proof and systematic thinking. He knew that if poetry fought positivism on positivism's playing field, it would lose. And so, instead, Richards decided to forge a separate status for poetry that would allow it to exist alongside rather than in opposition to science. In an early essay called Science and Poetry, he coined the phrase pseudo-statements to distinguish poetic statements from those made by science. Now, pseudo-statements literally in Greek means false statements, pseudo-statements. But by that phrase, he did not mean to suggest that poetry was false, even though it sort of sounds like that. If he did that, he would just be accepting that either-or fact-fiction dichotomy of positivism. He would just be falling into this. It's either false or it's true. It's either scientific or it's not. So that's not what he meant by pseudo-statement. He didn't mean false statement. Rather, what he's trying to say is that the claims and resolutions of poetry must not be judged by the same criteria or from the same perspective as those of science. Now, that's what he meant. Unfortunately, pseudo-statement was probably not the best word to come up with. What is he saying? Let me put it in terms I've used earlier in this lecture. It's as if he's saying to Plato, don't judge poetry by the standards of philosophy. That's not fair. Well, that's kind of what he's trying to get out with the word pseudo-statements. Well, it quickly became clear that pseudo-statements was too crude and too problematic and not clear enough. And so, in practical criticism, a later, more mature work, Richards refined his terminology, replacing the cruder notion of pseudo-statements with a more nuanced distinction between intellectual belief and emotional belief. Intellectual belief will be linked to science, emotional belief will be linked to poetry. Let's see how the dichotomy works. According to Richards, intellectual belief occurs in a rational context of logical consistency and it seeks as its end the fusion of all ideas into a perfect, ordered system. That's what intellectual belief does. That's what science does. It wants to be rational. It wants to be logical. It has to be consistent in a sort of mathematical way. 1 + 1 was always equal to. And again, the end point, what intellectual belief is seeking, is a perfect ordered system. Some kind of theory or system that everything can work together in consistently. Emotional belief, on the other hand, occurs in an emotional context of sentiments and feelings. Not in that rational context of logical consistency, but again, an emotional context of sentiments and feelings. Its end is to so order ideas around our emotional needs and desires as to pave the way for their fulfillment. Again, you cannot treat a poem like a mathematical proof, and you can't judge it that way. Poems are linked towards emotion. What they're trying to do is to fulfill our emotional needs rather than a need for an intellectual system. And so, emotional belief is not verified by any external standard of systematic coherence, but by its success at meeting our emotional needs and desires. Again, totally different criteria going on here. Does it meet our emotional needs? Therefore it's good. That's how you judge it, not by whether or not it's, logically consistent and verifiable. All right, now, although emotional belief can sometimes accompany intellectual belief, it can, and in much great poetry does, exist by itself. You can have a poem that has a little element of intellectual belief, but you can have one that's totally emotional belief. Here's the proof. Think about it. Dante's Divine Comedy, hailed as a great work by so many people. And, you can still be moved by Dante, even if you don't agree with his, quote, religion. You see, we don't need to share Dante's medieval Catholic Christianity, nor his pre-Copernican view of the universe to accept the emotional, psychological, and aesthetic truth of his Divine Comedy. We don't have to believe. We could be an atheist and be profoundly moved and challenged and taught by the Divine Comedy. And this is also true that a religious person can learn from a poet who's an atheist. I mean, again, it's emotional belief. That is, it's working within a system that is intellectual belief, but the poem itself is emotional belief. Now, this is a lot like Coleridge's willing suspension of disbelief, isn't it? And Richards admits that it's like the willing suspension of disbelief, but Richards says, I think in a little bit of a catty fashion, that he says, well, Coleridge's notion is only true in part. In reality, Richards says, there is no need for suspension at all, since neither intellectual belief nor unbelief are a factor in the reading of poetry. We don't even have to worry about suspending anything because that kind of intellectual belief that we want to suspend is irrelevant to poetry. All right. Richards, remember, was an early new critic. He's right at the beginning, and so, we might argue, he never really broke from the positivistic tendency to judge a thing by its usefulness, to treat it as a means to an end. What I'm saying here is that he was trying so hard to break from positivism, but he wasn't fully successful. Because think about it. He is still trying to judge poetry by how useful it is, emotionally rather than intellectually, but he's still thinking in positivistic terms. Positivism tends to be utilitarian. It's got to be useful. It's got to be a means to an end. And so it was up to later new critics to go closer to Kant's idea of pure beauty as a thing in itself, as something that does not focus on ends, that does not halt the free play of mind. So, again, later new critics are going to get more aesthetic in the Kantian sense. They're going to move farther and farther away from this positivistic notion of usefulness towards art as a free play of ideas. And we're going to see that as we move it through new criticism. And indeed, for John Crowe Ransom, who comes after Richards, this need for free play would take on many meanings. We'll look at the aesthetic, ontological meaning of this change. And at the very end of the essay, I'm going to show you that this new change, this aesthetic change, also has, believe it or not, political connotation.